Hello, I'm Mr. McBrien. This is TEJ20 Software. Ontario would like for students to be able to assemble, repair, and configure computers with various types of operating systems and application software, and also to be able to demonstrate an understanding of ethical and security issues related to the use of computers. And that's what we'll spend our time on today. So let's start by talking about the types of software. There are two main types of software. There's system software that controls the computer's operations and allows for very simple user activities. And then there's application software that runs on top of the operating system and allows users to do specific tasks, things like word processing and various photo editing and other exercises like this. Now, operating systems are the interface between the application and the computer system. We already talked about this. There are various OSs, including the ancient DOS, Microsoft Windows, Linux, Mac OS, Android, etc. Now, the role of the operating system software is various hardware functions, keeping the hardware going, giving the user an interface to access that hardware, managing system memory, doing various processing tasks, allowing for networking, access to system resources, and file management, so moving files around. Now, we don't much talk about command line operating systems anymore. They used to be the norm, of course. You had to type in any commands you wanted to happen. You had to be a fairly savvy user to be able to work with them. MS-DOS is now pretty much gone by the wayside, but Linux is still here. Having said that, even Linux has a GUI now, a graphical user interface, that allows us to work through icons and menus in order to do the things we need to do. A visual interface rather than a text interface. Application software is specialized software designed to do specific things. There are lots of examples. I'm sure you can think of them. Hey, anybody heard of WordPerfect? That's getting a little old now. There are various things you can do with applications, including word processing, spreadsheets, desktop publishing, graphics software, you name it. Now, we lump application software, we lump programming tools into application software as well. You could just easily make this list as I could, I'm sure. Now, the world is changing. So more and more applications are being offered over the cloud. In other words, major parts of the overhead of running the applications are done on servers off-site. And this has advantages both for vendors and for the users. The vendors find it easier to support because they know what machines the applications are running on. The vendors also the developers have control of access. They can decide who accesses their applications and when. From a user point of view, we have less requirements for hardware in our home or office because of the fact that the servers are doing so much of the work. There's also a major advantage of cloud-based work in that if it doesn't matter where I'm located, as long as I have a suitable browser, I can go ahead and access the applications and my files. Now, this cloud-based work, this server that is doing a lot of the heavy lifting with the application, this doesn't mean that nothing is being done on the PC, on the user computer. So some operations are still done there for various reasons. Examples of cloud-based applications: Office 365, Google Docs, and lots more. We use many of these in computer engineering. Now this leads us to a question. We talked about the software developer controlling the access to cloud-based applications. Should all software be free? I'd invite you to pause the movie for a second and think about how you feel about that. Okay, maybe some of you hit on the idea that if software isn't profitable, if users don't pay something, then development of software is going to be rather slow, or it'll stop completely and software won't be available. Let's talk a little bit about software licensing for a second. We can talk about traditional software licensing versus the way that the internet has changed how software works. Traditionally, we bought a disk. We installed it on our computer and we ran that software whenever we wanted. So we owned a license and that was great. Some software licenses were and are free, and you may be able to think of some examples of this. When this occurs, the software vendor has to find another way to stay in business, of course. Now, selling these disks is not ideal for a software vendor. These perpetual licenses can become very inconvenient, and there are reasons for this. Let's take an example of Microsoft Word. Microsoft Word is obviously word processing software, and Microsoft has been selling this for more than a decade now, and they've sold many licenses. Now, traditionally, if you sold a license for software, you hope that people would upgrade it at a later date. And in fact, there have been many versions of Microsoft Word over the years. But the problem is that word processing isn't all that complicated an exercise. And old versions of Microsoft Word are still quite effective. I believe on my computer I'm using Word 2003. And it's quite useful. There isn't much reason for me to buy a new license to Microsoft Word. Now, if everybody takes that approach, then Microsoft Word won't be profitable, and Microsoft will lose a lot of money and have to decide what to do about it. There are other things. Older software may have bugs that don't get fixed. It may have compatibility issues, for example, with new printers and things like this. All those old copies of Microsoft Word lying around and Microsoft Office lying around are inconvenient for Microsoft. Now, they would prefer to have users who are using their software pay them every year. They have predictable revenue. They get paid for the development as it goes, and to a large extent they can control what version of software people are using. Consumers also get advantages with this software as a service model to a certain extent, because in theory they pay less for the software up front and only pay as they use it. And if they stop using a given piece of software, they can stop paying for it. Now, that software as a service implies that the vendor knows who is using what software. So the internet is a critical portion of this business model, and you can take it one step further and have the software not just as a service where they monitor your use of an application installed on your hard drive, but they can also provide that to you through the cloud. Now, we in TEJ talk about Linux a lot. Linux is an example of open source software, and there are many other examples. Open source software is intended to be a collaborative development project where anyone can open up the source code for a given application and make modifications to it. Now, it's not precisely free. Before you download that code, you need to typically agree to terms about how you're going to use it. For example, you're not allowed to sell software that you develop from open source code. What this implies, though, is that open source software, you also don't have to pay for it. So you can install it to your computer for free and use it for free. Obviously, this has some advantages. So it's free to install the software. If you don't like the software and you have the skills, you can actually go and make modifications to it. If you don't have the skills but you have money, you can pay someone else to make modifications to it. Because there are skilled people out there who are passionate about open source, new features often come quite quickly. But open source has some disadvantages as well. If the software is free, who's motivated to give you tech support? Well, in fact, it is under typical open source licensing agreements, it is allowed to charge for tech support on those things. But then is the software really free? Now, the developers who develop open source software may not have passion around the usability of that software. They tend to have great expertise and often have considerable tolerance for less than ideal user experiences. With fast development typically comes lots of bugs. So you may have issues with software that doesn't work the way you hope. There's another aspect of this. When you download open source software, part of the agreement to download that software and install it is that you absolve the developers of liability. So if you have a big business and a bug in open source software you've decided to use costs you $100 million because the plane that you develop has a significant design flaw, well, who are you going to sue? And the answer is you can't. So you're accepting all the liability for the way that software behaves on yourself. Now, if none of these things are a concern to you, open source may be the right kind of software for you. Now, if you don't want to use open source software, you might ask yourself, well, why not use pirated software? Why not use software that has been modified to no longer require registration numbers, for example? And you may decide that prosecution isn't a concern. In fact, it is fairly rare that people are prosecuted for using pirated software versus distributing it. Well, one of the answers we've already come up with, right? You're not going to receive tech support from Microsoft if you install a pirated copy of Windows. Also, the people who created and distributed that pirated software may have added some extra special additional features to that pirated software. So that's something for you to think about. And If we want to get to it, we can talk about the morals of it. So, stealing software is still stealing. And when it comes down to it, if software is useful to you, you should do your part to help pay the salaries of the people that created it. If you wouldn't go to the grocery store and steal from your local grocer, then you probably shouldn't be going out and stealing software. Okay, so that's our quick run through software for today. You should be able to differentiate between system software and application software. Of course, we have examples of operating systems, and you can probably list those. Software makers have various models for keeping in business. There's free open source software, where if a business is working around it, they'll typically sell tech support for it. There's the older perpetual licenses where we buy a disk and install it, software as a service, and we can have cloud-based versus thick client applications. For your homework, you should be pretty much completing your computer build by now. Don't forget to install Chrome on your build computer. What other applications are you going to install? You can think about that. Thanks very much. Have a great night.